Welcome along to a brand new episode of Writer's Routine. This week with A.L. Brody / Jason Pinter. They're one and the same. His new novel is Dating and Dismemberment. A brilliant title for a monster rom-com. We talk about his winding path to publication. Also, how he's improved his first draft.
I would write my first draft and then go back to edit it and review and just be like, it basically looked like I vomited 90 to 100,000 words onto a page. And it's like, okay, now I need to sift through that and reorder everything. Whereas now I can take longer for each first draft. When I'm going through that, it's less surgery. I guess a few books ago, there definitely needed to be a lot more work done on them. Not to say that I don't take editing seriously, but I do think my first drafts are better now just because I have more time to work on them.
And why, when it came to marketing, he learned to do it all himself?
I gotta say it was all TikTok. And it's funny because I am a guy in my 40s, which is generally not the type of person you would think to sort of build an audience on as a writer or a bookish person on TikTok. But I started doing these sort of sketches. There's sort of a joke, especially in romance, that men don't know how to write romance and don't know how to write women. I think I pride myself in writing women strong and developed women. But I started to do these sketches sort of making fun at how bad a lot of men wrote women. And they got really popular. And I started building 10,000 followers, 20,000 followers, 30,000 followers. And now I'm at almost 60,000 followers. And people like these sketches a lot. And when they found out I had a book coming out, all of a sudden it's like not only do I have all these followers, but they like my sense of humor. It directly tied into Dating and Dismemberment, which is really kind of meant to be sort of a funny, crazy, zany romantic comedy, like unhinged romantic comedy. And it was really just all TikTok. I started tailoring my marketing to not just, hey, buy my book, but to really trying to do some creative marketing, doing sketches, doing funny things.
It's all on the way with A.L. Brody in this week's Writer's Routine. Yes, welcome along to the show. It's Writer's Routine, where we take a look inside an author's working day. My name's Dan Simpson. Thank you so much for finding us. Thank you for being there, for coming back. This week, we're with A.L. Brody. Well, Jason Pinter as well, author of Dating and Dismemberment, which is a monster rom-com. He's written thrillers and crime as Jason Pinter, also YA novels, kids' books as well. He's been nominated for the Thriller Award, the Barry Award, the RT Reviewers' Choice Award, and now he's back with a new series as A.L. Brody. His publishing history is a winding one, doing it traditionally, then independently, and now back to traditional publishing with Dating and Dismemberment. It's a brilliant title and a unique idea, a monster rom-com. It's in line with Emily Henry and Grady Hendrix, who's also been on the show. We talk about the bonus creativity that a singular idea such as this allowed him. Also how he's learned to work without the muse striking, kind of getting down to it, making sure it happens. It's always so useful to hear how someone does that. We talk about what he's read to get the tone right, writing for so many different audiences. How does he know where this story is aimed, and what helped him steer clear of making a monster rom-com pitched for an audience perhaps a bit too young for it? Now, this was released last year. I have no idea why it's not been released until now. No reason. So let's get it on. And we start, as we always do, with A.L. Brody, with what he sees around him in the place where he sits down to write.
So I have a home office where I write, with my desk up against a pretty large two windows that are bracketed by a lot of trees, probably too many trees, with a slight view of our backyard with my daughter's swing set on it. So that's the view where I write. It's a nice day out right now, so it's pretty sunny. And then I'm surrounded by bookshelves, a printer, stacks of books, a Lego set of Jaws, because Jaws is my favorite movie of all time, and a plastic skeleton, because you need a plastic skeleton in your office.
Okay, where did you acquire a plastic skeleton from?
We bought it for Halloween one year. My daughter's named it Mr. Bones, and he's sort of become a bit of a family mascot. And because some of my recent books have been in the horror and horror adjacent realms, he's become sort of a bit of a co-host for some of my promotional and marketing videos.
Right. Okay. So that's good. A lot of books around you. You've got a stunning view out the front. You've got Mr. Bones. What around you might be particularly inspirational and perhaps pertinent to the writing, the project that you're on at the moment? Do we have Post-it notes? Do we have a whiteboard? What lets you know what you're doing?
Oh, so I have, well, first of all, I have shelves full of all the books that I've written and published, and I can see them when I write, and that is a big motivating factor, just to see what I've done, where I've come from, everything I've done over a nearly, I guess a 15-year kind of writing career. And then I have all my, so I'm working right now on the sequel to Dating and Dismemberment that will be out next year. And I have all my notes for that book, all the research. I'm sort of funny in the sense that I text myself nonstop throughout the day. Anytime I come up with an idea or a scene or anything, I always text it to myself, and then I copy and paste that text into a document which I keep open while I write, which can be everything from information about a scene, a character motivation, even a single line of dialogue that I like. Then I incorporated that document, and by the end of a project, it can be 25 pages single spaced, all of text messages to myself. So I keep all of that sort of open. But more than anything, I love being surrounded by books. That is my biggest motivation in the world. And as much as I love writing in coffee shops or airplanes or things like that, just being surrounded by books just gets my creative juices flowing. That's my favorite thing about my office.
This document full of your text messages, when you send the message to yourself, what thing might it say? What might a text message from Jason to Jason read like?
Oh, so I will give you an example of the most recent one. This was just an idea that I have. Basically, I'm sort of putting ideas together for what my project is going to be after the final book in the Dating and Dismemberment trilogy finishes. That book will be out, I believe, next spring or summer. And so even though I'm in the middle of writing a book right now, I'm always sort of thinking about what's coming next, and have an idea for sort of a dark romance thriller trilogy that I want to work on next. And it was literally just an idea for that. It was like a line of dialogue that the male main character says to the female main character. And it's just a line of dialogue. I don't want to say what it is yet because I like to kind of keep things a little bit close to the vest. But all it is, it's just a line of dialogue. And I have not even started writing this book proper yet. But it was a line of dialogue that was so good to me that when I do start to write it, I had to incorporate it. So it can be anything from here's a scene breakdown to I'm stuck at a part and here's an idea for it to a simple line of dialogue. And that's sort of what I love about how my mind works, that I can kind of just like anything from little tiny pieces of things to larger things with much grander implications for an entire series.
What's the organization and form of this other Word document you've got? So is there like an order to it? Do you know where things are? Like you might be right.
Yes. So I once I have enough, I guess, text messages or ideas, I break it down between larger ideas, which I guess are sort of have larger implications for if I'm writing a series, larger implications for the series, character arcs, things like that, to smaller things like, okay, this needs to happen in a scene, and I'll break it down chronologically. This is chapter 1, this is chapter 2, et cetera, et cetera. Then it can be character notes, so I'll have biographies for each of the main characters and some of the more prominent secondary characters. So I'll incorporate each of those pieces into the character biographies. And then there's a section where it's just ideas. And I would say I only maybe use 30% of them, but it's just so I can kind of at some point go back and look over them and say, like, that will work, that will not work. And it's just sort of like a general, it's sort of like a bin where I throw everything. And once in a while I look through it and say, okay, that was nonsense. That's not going to work. Or, you know what, that is going to work, and I'm going to incorporate that somehow. So it starts out a complete mess. And then the more pieces I add to it, the more organized it gets. And then if you I always have a bit of a outline when I start a book. If you look at the outline compared to the finished book, a lot of that finished book will have these notes and texts incorporated. So it's sort of almost like an artifact. It almost becomes a bit of an artifact where at the beginning to the end, you can see how the book evolved and how many pieces of all these sort of random ideas get incorporated into that final book.
I mean, you've published quite a lot. There's a lot of your novels out there under a couple of different names, different series, different genres and styles. The way that you're planning and researching to a degree, that's quite unique. How did you stumble upon the method of texting yourself?
Oh, well, this is, I wouldn't say that's sort of research. Obviously, so for a book I released earlier this year called Past Crimes, which is sort of a dystopian science fiction thriller that has a lot about true crime and virtual reality and AI and even theme park organization and building. That book required a significant amount of research. So even though I still have sort of my text chain to myself, I also on my computer have pretty vast folders of all the research I did. And that can be anything from articles to books to even audio clips. I had to listen to a lot of various audio clips and podcasts in the research of that book. So the sort of the texting myself is sort of one part of it. Though that's almost more just sort of like when inspiration strikes. I can be out going for a walk. I run a lot. So if I'm out running and something pops into my head, I can text it to myself so I don't forget. That's sort of more just a general, hey, this is an idea. I don't want to forget it. If I'm going for a run, I can forget it in 20 minutes as well. I'll have it sort of to go and come back on. So it is a sort of split between real heavy duty research that is pretty well organized and then just sort of the detritus of my mind, I would say. And as with any sort of, you're sifting for gold, 90% of what you're sifting is going to be just sort of rocks and dirt. But every now and then you're going to find something that's worth something. And so I keep all of it together because in that sort of detritus, I will find things that are worth keeping.
We get quite niche and nerdy around here. So we talk about software and typeface and font. Now, we know you write on Word. Have you got any kind of font or typeface preferences?
I like Adobe Garamond. That is that for whatever reason that has become my go-to font when I'm writing. And then if there are things if there are like the text messages between characters in the book, I'll sometimes change that up just so it sticks out a little bit more. Maybe I'll use just a Times New Roman or an Arial for that and then bold it. But Adobe Garamond has become my go-to font for whatever reason. So I'm a big fan.
Is everything that you do typed out onto a screen? Do you ever dabble in a more romantic longhand?
I have the worst handwriting you've ever seen in your life. And that is not hyperbole. It is absolutely terrible to the point where when I sign books for readers, I legitimately feel bad sometimes because I feel like they're expecting this grand, romantic, flowing signature that looks like something like, out of the 1800s. In the reality, my handwriting has probably not changed since the third grade, and it's probably gotten worse since then. So I could never write a book longhand because I would not be able to read 90% of it. So, sometimes I'll take notes in longhand, but then I'll always type them up. But the absolute truth is I have terrible, terrible handwriting. I would not trust myself to write a book longhand and then be able to decipher my chicken scratch. So when I wake up, the first 2 hours of my day are dedicated towards getting my kids awake, fed, dressed, and out the door. And that is a stressful period. Once my kids are out the door, I sit down. I'll generally go through my emails, make sure see if there's anything pertinent. This morning I had to fill out a couple forms for my publisher. And then I start writing. So right now I'm working on the next book in the Dating and Dismemberment series. It'll be out in, I think, early-ish 2025. I'm finishing that up right now. And I write, and I don't necessarily have a specific word count. I'd love to aim for 1,500 to 2,000 words a day. There's some days we get at 1,000. There's some days where just the words are flowing and I've gotten 3,000 to 4,000. There's some writers who they talk about writing 10,000 words a day, and that just boggles my mind. My mind would turn to mush after that. I'll generally take a break for lunch. Then my kids get home around between 3:30 and 4, and then it's then they have all sorts of activities, so it becomes sort of madness. And then I try to get a little bit of work done when they go to bed. I think that's usually around after 8 or 8:30. I don't write full time. I ran an independent publishing company called Polis Books, which unfortunately closed down in the spring summer 2024. So when that was up and running, that also took up a significant amount of my time. So I sort of, between the hours of, I'd say, 9 to 4, it's generally split between writing and working on Polis. Right now, with the company closed, I'm devoting more time to writing, especially when I have a lot of projects coming out in late 2024 and then going into 2025. And then I just kind of split up my day through that. And by the time my kids get home and I go to bed, I hope we've gotten a pretty productive day.
At times when you are having to split your day between maybe different projects, or when you had the publishing company, was there an optimum amount of time that you would be writing for? Say, did you need hours at a time? Did you need the chunks to allow yourself to get into it? Or are you pretty good at doing a bit of writing, sending off an email halfway through, coming back to write, doing a bit of research and covering it all like that?
I wouldn't say I need a specific amount of time. It's more a feel of productivity. It's a feeling that when your day is over, you've gotten the work done that you wanted to get done. I mean, like I said, if I get 1,000 words, but they're good words, and it's a scene I'm really happy with, or it progresses the story, or there's just an interaction that I love, it's more about a feeling of sort of accomplishment. Like, okay, this day moved the story along, moved the characters along, set things in motion a little bit. There are times in the past when, especially when my children were younger, when I never had. I'd say, there was one of my books called A Stranger at the Door, which is the second book in my Rachel Marin thriller series. I don't think any of that, I think that entire book was written in 15 to 30 minute windows because I had a newborn at home and another toddler. I think my daughters are 16 months apart. So my youngest had just been born and my oldest was like 16 to 17 months. And just with having two young kids, it was literally you write when you can. And that entire book was written in 15 to 30 minute bursts. So now I'm fortunate that they're a bit older and they're away out of school from 9 to 4-ish. And I can devote most of those 7 hours to writing. So it's certainly a lot more productive. There's a lot less pressure to, if you have half an hour, there's a lot of pressure to make that half an hour a good half hour. Whereas now I can give myself a little bit more grace. So if I feel like I closed my laptop at the end of the day and I felt like it was productive, and I feel like the best feeling to me is when you go to bed thinking about the story because you've progressed it enough to the point where you as the writer want to know what happens next. So if I go to bed wanting to know what's happening next and wanting to wake up the next morning, open up my laptop and get right back into it, then I know I've had a productive day.
You speak about the grace, almost the liberty of having a bit more time now. With that, do some unhealthy or annoying practices kind of creep in? Like when you only have half an hour to write, as you said, you need to be on it. You need to be pretty good at making every single second count. But now, do you find yourself being maybe a bit laid back and casual, and you need certain things to help you get into it, which you've never needed before, and that all gets a bit annoying? I'm not sure.
Well, I would say when you only have 15 to 30 minute windows, you don't have the luxury of waiting for the muse to kind of descend on high and tap you on the shoulder and say, now is the time to write. Let's think about the story, because when your daughter falls asleep next to you and you have 30 minutes before she needs to be fed, you got to start working. Nowadays, if you have 7 hours or so, you don't need to spend every minute of that typing away. You can think a little bit. You can ruminate on things a little bit. I imagine most writers do. I love to read. And to me, what also helps get my creative juices flowing is reading a little bit. So if I'm kind of stuck, or if I've been writing for like an hour or two and I feel like I'm kind of hitting up a wall, I'll read a little bit. And generally the act of reading gets my mind working for a little bit. So I can add things into my day that even if they're not the act of writing itself, they all go into the writing. And I think there's, a lot of people say that a big part of writing is almost kind of like staring off into the void. And I fully agree with that. You need time to think. You need time to let a story evolve in your mind a little bit. And I have more time to do that now. So I think the stories probably have time to breathe a little bit more. It's less frenetic.
Oh, so do you feel that the case in your first draft? I know by the time it goes to print, you will have cut it down, you will have trimmed, you will have probably made it as punchy as it needs to be. But when you get your first draft done, do you feel that you can sense that time and that space in the books that you're writing? You can feel it, that there's been a bit more rumination on it.
Oh, absolutely. My first drafts are better now than they were a few years ago. I think it was more back when I had less time. I would write my first draft and then go back to edit it and review and just be like, it basically looked like, I vomited, 90 to 100,000 words onto a page. And it's like, okay, now I need to sift through that and reorder everything. Whereas now, I can take longer for each first draft. And I do think each first draft is better. When I'm going through that, it's less less surgery, I guess. There definitely a few books ago, there definitely needed to be a lot more work done on them. Not to say that I don't take editing seriously, but I do think my first drafts are better now just because I have more time to work on them.
How planned out are you when you sit there first thing of the day? Do you might not have an aim or a word count, but do you know what it is you're trying to tackle that day?
Yeah, so one of the things I've started doing recently is that a lot of people say there are pantsers and there are plotters when it comes to writing, and the plotters are the people who write out an 80-page single spaced outline of the entire book really before they start to write, and then they just sort of fill in the gaps. And they're the pantsers who kind of fly by the seat of their pants. I'm somewhere in the middle there where I generally go into a book now and I write a chapter outline, which I've been doing for the last few books, and that's been really helpful. So if, for example, the new book is, I think the aim is to be somewhere between around 35 chapters. And for each chapter, I have a 1 or 2 sentence description of what's going to happen in that chapter. And obviously it may change a little bit, but it gives me direction where I know that chapter 18 is going to be this, leading into chapter 19, which is going to be that. So it is a little bit more organized than it used to be, but I am still sort of a pantser in the sense that I don't have every scene, every chapter, every interaction mapped out. It works for me to let my characters breathe and letting them surprise me a little bit and seeing how they change over the course of the book in ways that were totally unexpected when I started the book. So even if I know what's going to generally happen in a character, I like to give myself the freedom for things to change and for characters to do things differently. And maybe they do something in chapter 21 that changes an idea that I had for chapter 24. And to me, that's exciting because that means the characters are kind of coming to life in my mind.
How often do they change in a way that's very frustrating, that drags you completely off course of where you wanted, where you thought you would be?
Pretty often, I would say. But I try to look at it in a positive way. So I released a book in August called The Reaper's Son, which is sort of I'd say a paranormal romance, sort of young adult, sort of like I call it The Fault in Our Stars meets Addie LaRue. And there's a character in that book named James Mungrow. And when I first started the book, he was going to be sort of a generic bully. He was going to be a schoolyard bully who was sort of an obstacle for our main characters and didn't really have a lot of traits beyond that. And then as I started writing, the more I thought about this character, and I was like, you know what? I don't like characters that are one-dimensional, that are kind of cardboard. And I know that I want him to be a bit of a bully because I think where the story goes, that needs to happen. They need to have this sort of obstacle. But his character changed my mind a lot. And I was like, I don't want him to be one-dimensional. If he is a bully, why is he that? What made him the way that he is? And he went from this sort of secondary character without a lot of characteristics to, in my mind, one of the most interesting characters in the book who has a legitimate arc that is as interesting and complete as anyone in the story. And it was frustrating at first because it was, okay, here's a character who's kind of a secondary character. He's not a main character. He's in maybe 10 out of the 30 or so chapters, but I needed to make this character more interesting. I need to learn more about him to understand him. And it was frustrating at first because it made things a lot more complicated. One-dimensional characters are easier because you don't have to go into their personalities and their psyches and their histories. But deciding that I wanted to learn more about him made it harder to do that. It certainly made the book more complicated, but it also made the book a lot better because you end up caring about this character and understanding him more. And then when his arc is complete, there's an emotion to it that would not have been there if I hadn't made that effort.
And just heading back to the day, do you do anything the day before that helps the day after perhaps start a little easier?
Oh, I don't think so. I wish I did. I generally, if I go to bed thinking about the book, there are definitely times, and my wife will back this up. There are times I'll be lying there in bed. Maybe we'll like watch TV or read before bed, and we'll turn the lights out, and she'll see the glare from my phone, and it's because I have an idea in my mind for my writing the next day, and I'm texting myself. So that'll often lead into the next day, where in the morning I'll sort of wake up and look at my text messages like, okay, this is what I was thinking last night. And a lot of times that will sort of get my creative juices flowing for the day. But it's the best feeling in the world when you're about to go to bed and you're still thinking about the book, and you can kind of prep yourself and think about ideas for the next day's work.
So let's just talk about your path to publication then, as an author under a contract with a traditional publisher, because that's where you are at the moment. I know that and you're reissuing Dating and Dismemberment, right? That you had kind of put out there as an indie. So you're taking quite a winding path. Can you just, I guess, firstly, being a successful indie author, why did you want to do it the traditional way? And how have you made that happen quite a long way into a busy and best-selling writing career?
That was a very strange situation. And when people say, like, how did you do that? Do you have any advice for it? And the truth is, it was such a strange situation that I don't know if it could be replicated. I had released or I was under contract for a traditional publisher to publish a book called Past Crimes, which came out in the past February. Before that, I'd actually been on submission with The Reaper's Son, which I also independently published in August. That book had been on submission for a very long time and hadn't sold, and that really it really got to me because I loved that book. And it was sort of towards the end of the pandemic. I had written a lot of really dark stuff. Past Crimes is a pretty dark book. And as a lot of people were during the pandemic, I was kind of going through a bit of a difficult emotional time. And I wanted to write a book that brought me joy and made me happy and was not so dark. And I came upon the idea for Dating and Dismemberment, which was just fun and crazy and weird. And I didn't know if anybody would get it or like it, but it made me happy. Just this idea of sort of like this crazy romantic comedy featuring these monsters who, kill people, these sort of famous monsters. And I loved the book so much. I didn't know if anybody would get it or read it. And I'd been on submission for so long with The Reaper's Son, and that really disillusioned me. I didn't want to take this book, which I already thought there might not be a market for this. I had no idea. I didn't want to go on submission with that book and wait a year and a half just for a whole bunch of people to say, I don't get it. So I was like, you know what? I want to put this book out there. If people get it, great. I think there might be a readership. Travis Baldree had recently published Legends and Lattes, which on the face of it, you think, who's going to read a book about like an orc opening a coffee shop when who wants to read a fantasy novel without big battles and big stakes? I thought that there could be a market for a book that was a little more offbeat and funny without huge stakes. And it coincided with a time when I was, strangely enough, getting popular on TikTok. I'd opened up a TikTok account, was using it for sort of a bit of a creative outlet. But I was like, you know what? Books that are offbeat are doing well. I have a bit of a following. I think I can do well with this on my own. So it was never shopped around. I independently published it last summer 2023, and it did better than I could have ever imagined. I made more money off of that book in a couple months than I made from my last 2 or 3 traditional publishing advances combined. And I was approached by Entangled Publishing, which published, Fourth Wing and Iron Flame, and has published these huge sort of romances and fantasies. And they were looking to kind of bolster their romance line. And they were talking to a lot of sort of successful independently published authors about getting their books traditional print distribution. I had essentially gone as far with Dating and Dismemberment as I could, with all the sales being online through like Amazon or bookshop.org or selling through the TikTok shop. but I would never be able to get that distribution into bookstores. And I figured there was no downside to working with them because if they can get the book into bookstores, which I can't do on my own, the ceiling for this is raised significantly. The book is. I'm already playing with the house's money. The book has already done way better than I ever thought it could. If there's a chance to sort of add some gas to the fire, I'd be crazy to say no to it. So there was no downside to me agreeing to work with them. And then they wanted to do 2 more books in the series, which they'll be publishing for the first time ever. And this little book that I wrote in literally 2 months is now turning into this trilogy coming out from the publisher of Fourth Wing. So it is the strangest situation and one that I could never replicate again in 100 years of writing.
When you were responsible for making sure your book sold, because you were doing it on your own as an indie, what were you doing to get it out there?
I got to say it was all TikTok. And it's funny because I am a guy in my 40s, which is generally not the type of person you would think to sort of build an audience on as a writer or a bookish person on TikTok. But I started doing these sort of sketches. There's sort of a joke, especially in romance, that men don't know how to write romance and don't know how to write women. I think I pride myself in writing women strong and developed women. But I started to do these sketches sort of making fun at how bad a lot of men wrote women. And they got really popular. And I started building 10,000 followers, 20,000 followers, 30,000 followers. Now I'm at almost 60,000 followers. And people like these sketches a lot. And when they found out I had a book coming out, all of a sudden it's like not only do I have all these followers, but they like my sense of humor. It directly tied into Dating and Dismemberment, which is really kind of meant to be sort of a funny, crazy, zany romantic comedy, like unhinged romantic comedy. And it was really just all TikTok. I started tailoring my marketing to not just, hey, buy my book, but to really trying to do some creative marketing, doing sketches, doing funny things. And it worked for whatever reason. And that was really sort of it, is that I found this community, I built a following, and I was doing the kind of content that was appealing to them. And then it sort of snowballed from there, where people were buying the book and reading the book and posting their own videos about it. And all of a sudden I'm getting tagged in dozens and dozens of videos of people reading the book and saying how much they loved it. And it became this sort of community, and it's really been wonderful. But that's again, when I say, like, I can't replicate that. If you had told me a couple of years ago that I would have published a monster romantic comedy and market it successfully through TikTok, I would have never believed you in a million years.
Well, I know that the idea of what works well on TikTok is almost, it's more volatile than the ever-changing idea of what works well in publishing. Like it's almost a new day when there's a new trend where people are into new things. And well, I mean, you as you said, as a 40-odd-year-old dude, like
Yep.
You're not target for TikTok. So what were you doing to try and capture the trends of what the app wanted us to see?
I think this is sort of what worked for me, is that I wasn't specifically looking to do trends. And this is going to sound really conceited, but I created a bit of a trend in these videos where I was sort of making fun of men writing women. So these videos I was doing were getting millions and millions of views. And after mine started to be successful, I started getting emails and started getting tagged in other videos of other people doing similar videos, being like, hey, I love these videos. Do you mind if I do my own take on them? And like, it sounds conceited, but I'm really stating as a fact, is that I created this trend where now all these people started doing videos like mine, just doing their spins on them, and they would tag me in them and say, like, Jason inspired me to do them. And it was really sort of just that, where I don't dance. I definitely do not dance. I think that's sort of the common assumption, that if you're going to be on TikTok, you have to dance. I think people respond to enjoyable content. And that's really what I was trying to make my marketing enjoyable. I just didn't want to just make videos saying, hey, buy my book. I wanted to make the kind of marketing videos where people might actually forward it to their friends to say, this is funny. And I think there's a big gap between just sort of marketing and the kind of marketing that actually appeals to people and can, I guess, go viral. Because if it's funny, people will pass it along. So I really tried to make my content the kind of thing that I thought would get passed along and tie my marketing into that. And that's really where it came from. And then, it got crazy in the best possible way.
We'll have more in just a sec. This week's episode is sponsored by the Quick Book Reviews podcast. 2 brand new episodes a week. It's a light-hearted look at authors and what you might love about their new book. Search for the Quick Book Reviews podcast wherever you get your shows. Also, we're sponsored by The Missing, the brand new book from Fleur MacDonald. And you can sponsor the show in the future. If you've written something, if you've got a creative endeavour, a big project which deserves more plug-in, deserves more people talking about it, well, let me do that for you. You can support the show on our Patreon page. For just a few dollars a month, you get bonus content, there is merch, and there is the way to get your book to sponsor the show. Now, anything that you can send my way goes an extraordinarily long way to helping me keep bringing you these chats with the biggest authors around as often as I can. You can do that on Patreon. That's as a rolling monthly pledge. You can make it one and done. That's absolutely fine. Send what you can to our Ko-Fi page. Just one tip, one donation goes a very long way. I promise you that. For both those ways to support the show on Patreon and Ko-Fi, take a look in the episode notes wherever you're listening. Let's get back to it then with this week's guest, A.L. Brody, Jason Pinter, talking about his new novel, Dating and Dismemberment. We talk all about getting the tone right, pitching it correctly. When you've written for so many audiences, how do you know who you're aiming at? Also, understanding his strange characters, and we hear about the myriad influences on them. And we get back to it, reflecting more about his publishing journey and what independent publishing taught him, which will help now going back into the traditional sphere.
Well, I would say the one benefit now is that I have a pretty strong online platform to promote it, but I've also have built a bit of a community, and I know this community will support my books and review my books and read my books, and I want to, make sure that they're appreciated. I think I think I have a decent eye and ear for design and marketing, and I think that's helped me a lot in my independent publishing career, but also in my career as a publisher of independent books, where I think you only stand out if you look both different and professional at the same time. And that's sort of that's a very difficult needle, I guess, threading the needle very delicately. Because for Dating and Dismemberment, I really wanted the book to stand out. I wanted the cover to be absolutely gorgeous, but I also wanted it to look different. So I hired a designer, this brilliant woman named Nicole Gu, who was nominated for an Eisner Award. And I worked with her to design the cover for Dating and Dismemberment. And it's good enough that Entangled is actually keeping that cover. They did like a couple of very, very minor tweaks. But that, to me, there was a lot of pride in the fact that I created a cover as an independent author to the point where a major publisher actually wanted to keep it because they thought, like, we're not going to improve on this. This is really good. So I think it's having faith in myself that I know what works and what doesn't work, and that I can also work with somebody, because Entangled knows what they're doing in terms of marketing and promotion and distribution way better than I do. And having faith in my abilities to market and to write and to get the word out there with a partner who can handle the operation side far better than I ever could.
Let's talk about the novel then that's coming back out. Well, it is back out now. Dating and Dismemberment. So this is a monster rom-com, which is a unique idea. Just if you can remember, it was probably a little while ago now. Take us through the very first idea that you had for what became this story.
Absolutely. I was looking for an idea for a book that was lighter than the past few books I'd written. previous books I'd written before that were Past Crimes and then the Rachel Marin series, Hideaway and A Stranger at the Door, which are all very, very dark. And I think I mentioned this, but I was going through, just as a lot of people were during the pandemic, just sort of an emotionally difficult time. And I wanted to write a book that just made me happy. And that was all I was looking for, a book that would just make me smile and make me laugh. And I don't remember the sort of, if there was like a light bulb that went off, but I love the idea of writing something sort of silly. And I love the idea of writing almost like a grown-up Monsters, Inc. in some ways, where I could create this whole world and have these two monsters who are sort of like, if you look at like Michael Myers or Jason Voorhees or Freddy Krueger and think like, well, what if they were quote unquote real people? What if they had lives? What if they had dilemmas? What if one of these monsters had an existential crisis and it stemmed from there? And then what if you have this world famous monster who is, deadly and feared and stalks his campground, sort of like Friday the 13th, like she stalks this campground. But what if she went through an existential crisis? And I love the idea of this deadly monster going through an existential crisis and having to sort of deal with that. And then the sort of, inciting element is, well, what happens if another monster comes in and takes over her territory because she's sort of been on the shelf? And what if they hate each other, but eventually start to fall in love with each other? And I just thought the idea of these two monsters fighting over the right to kind of haunt a summer camp, hating each other, but then falling for each other. I love that idea so much. And then creating the secondary characters, and they all have families. And my main character, Darla Drake, has a very fraught relationship with her mother. Her mother also happens to be a decapitated head. Who's very ornery and upset. And if you've seen The Sopranos, I sort of thought of her as well, what if Livia Soprano was just a severed head? And that would make her even more ornery. And I loved all these sort of crazy little details and essentially fleshing out this entire world of monsters who both hunted and killed people, but also had these sort of weird interior lives, including a desire for love. And it just that idea just stuck with me, and I loved it so much, and it made me so happy to write. And it's just, there's sometimes when you feel that a book chooses you, that book chose me. And it also allowed me to world build in a way that I had never really done before. Even though Past Crimes is sort of dystopian science fiction thriller, it is very much set in our world with our rules, just sort of extrapolated a little bit. Whereas I could create almost, in Star Wars, one of my inspirations was the Mos Eisley Cantina scene. I wanted to do my monster take on the Mos Eisley Cantina scene set at a summer camp. And just all those little things made me so happy and inspired me. And it was just the book I needed to write at the time. And I wrote the whole thing in 2 months because I just couldn't stop writing it. And I just, and it's funny you mentioned, if you can remember, because it was a little while ago, I've been promoting it and talking it up nonstop for a year and a half now. So that book, even though I started writing it, probably almost 2 years ago by the time this goes live, I think about it every day, especially because I'm now writing the sequels. So it just this one little kernel of an idea not only made me happy, but kind of changed my career in a lot of ways.
So you wrote it so quickly, and you're describing these really unique ideas, about Livia Soprano as a severed head, about the Star Wars canteen scene. So what was the process of having those ideas? Because there's room for a lot more creativity, I would say, in characterization with monsters than there might be in something set in the quote-unquote real world. Were the things kind of just popping into your head as you were writing, these quite unique ideas?
Well, I knew I wanted to. I knew my two main characters. I knew my main character was Darla Drake, aka the Duchess of Death, and she was going to be this sort of legendary monster, and on the surface, a legendary feared monster. But when you drill down deeper, she's struggling emotionally, as I was at the time. She has a bit of an existential crisis. She has a very difficult relationship with her mother. And I knew my male main character, Jarko Merkvale, who at first he kind of comes into the camp and he just wants to take over, and he's Darla's mortal enemy. But then the more we learn about him, he's got a bit of a backstory too. So I had the two main characters. Then it was like, okay, I need to create this entire world. I can't just have these two characters. Also, I knew Darla was going to have a mother who was just a severed head, and we'd know why she was just a severed head. There's a whole backstory there. I knew she was going to have a best friend, Gretel, and Gretel was going to be sort of like, if Darla can be a bit, ornery and grumpy sometimes, Gretel was going to be kind of like the sunshine to her grumpiness, just this very sort of upbeat best friend. But then if I was going to do sort of like the Mos Eisley Cantina scene from Star Wars, you need dozens of these characters. When you go into Star Wars, it's not just Chewbacca. There are dozens and dozens of animals and monsters and aliens and bounty hunters, and I needed all of that. And it was, okay, well, I need to make all these characters, and they're not all going to be major characters, but it allowed me to flex my creative muscles to create all these different characters, and they all had to be monsters. And then it was like, wait, I don't want them all to be Jason Voorhees, Freddy Krueger types. There are going to be some that are more animalistic. There are going to be some that are hybrid. There are going to be some that are, versions of fantastical classic monsters. And I was able to create this entire sort of world of monsters and see how they sort of fit into, and they had a whole society. And I love that so much, where in a weird way, it is fantastical and weird, but it is also very much grounded, where they have relationships and they have friends and they have jobs. And there's even sort of like a computer database that they can log into to kind of find out all these different things, almost like a monster version of Facebook. There's even a chapter that's on monster online dating, how do monsters online date. And it was on one hand it was such a joy to be able to do that, but it also pushed me, because if this one thing this book needed to feel was it had this sort of organic, fantastical world. So I had to create all these characters and figure out how they all interact with each other. And then not only that, but there's this whole world where, it's not just monsters at this one camp, but there are monsters all over the world, and give a bit of a bird's eye view of this whole monster world and ecosystem. And it was just sort of so much fun. It was hard, but it was a lot of fun to do.
It must be quite tricky when you're writing a monster story to get the tone right, simply because, well, discussing monsters, something partly inspired by Monsters Inc. as well. It could easily, and as someone who has written young adult and children's books, could easily kind of veer into that territory of maybe aiming too young. What were you doing whilst writing it with the language, with the plotting, with the characterization that made sure you would appeal to your adult contemporary horror comedy market?
Absolutely. I wanted to be funny, but I wanted to, if it might sound weird, I wanted to take it seriously. It may be a very weird thing to say when you're talking about like a monster romantic comedy, but I didn't want it to be a spoof. I wanted it to be silly, but not immature, if that makes sense. Like, there is some violence in it. And it's not gory violence, but there's some violence in it. And there are themes in the book that young people may not understand, where we learn about Darla and her relationship to her father. We learn early on that her father left her family, and she's dealing with all the emotions from that. And these are things that people deal with in real life. And even though the book is sort of silly and crazy and zany, I really wanted there to be a beating heart beneath it, where people feel for these characters. And I think it's the kind of book that if you're a teenager, you can read it. I think teenagers tend to kind of read up, but I also wanted to be very much in the vein of romantic comedy. So, of course, I read and listened to a lot of romantic comedies just to make sure I got the tone right, that the characters spoke in a more adult manner, that they had these interior lives where they weren't dealing with things like high school and college, but they're dealing with things like romance and relationships and families. And they're dealing with those things in a way that adults can relate to, or even, older teenagers can relate to. And it's like, I kind of compare it to like having Beetlejuice vibes, where you can certainly watch Beetlejuice as a teenager, but some of the humor is probably geared a little bit older. But it definitely has those sort of, that's the tone and vibe that I was going for. More Beetlejuice, more sort of Shaun of the Dead, where it was sort of silly and zany, but at the same time, there are these characters that you hopefully care for, that brought it out of the realm of children's books into more something that was set in our real world that more mature readers could enjoy too.
You mentioned that this last 18 months, really, since doing it indie to the now going traditionally has changed your life, really. How much has it changed the way you will approach publication in the next 18 months, do you think?
Well, it's certainly given me more options than I ever had before. I think previously my mindset was, well, you have to do it traditionally. If you don't do it traditionally, it's just too difficult. You don't know if there's a readership there. Also, I think the most successful indie authors tend to write romance or romance adjacent books, and I wasn't writing romance. And I knew from kind of keeping my finger on the pulse of the industry, that if you're just writing thrillers, it can be very hard to do that independently and do it successfully unless like lightning strikes. Now that I've sort of established myself a little bit writing either romance or things that are a little more fantasy or horror adjacent, I'm confident enough that I have a readership and I have a platform to the point where if I want to do something independently, I'm reasonably sure I can find a readership for it and do well. And at the same time, if I want to go traditional, I need to make sure that the partner and whatever financial arrangement there is makes sense for me and would make me know that I could do better traditionally than I could on my own. That was one of the considerations with Dating and Dismemberment when Entangled approached me is what they're offering going to increase my economic standing? And I believe it will. That was the reason I went with them. But if I want to independently publish a book and a publisher comes to me and says, we want to do this, but the financial or economic terms just don't make sense for me, I don't feel a need or pressure to go with them. In the past, I've certainly taken traditional publishing deals that were not optimal or had low advances, just because that's what you do. You find a publisher, and if they want to publish it, it kind of doesn't. As long as they're willing to publish it, hey, you should be grateful. This is going to sound sort of haughty, but I don't need to be grateful anymore. That if I'm not convinced somebody can do better with my book than I can, I'm not going to go with them because I have enough faith in myself to do well with it.
And that's it with A.L. Brody, Jason Pinter. Thank you so much for listening. So that book is Dating and Dismemberment. This was released last year, so he's got another book in this series out right now. You can find links to get it on our bookshop.org page, which helps this podcast, it helps Jason and your local independent bookshop, wherever you're listening. This week's episode is sponsored by the Quick Book Reviews podcast and also The Missing, the new novel from Fleur MacDonald. You can find out about supporting the show over on Patreon and Ko-Fi. We've dropped links in the podcast notes too. And I will see you next week with a brand new episode of the show. Until then,